Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So the Tories seem to just want to talk about taxes and how Labour will raise them. So it might be worth looking at what Labour are saying and what they might be saying if you read between the lines. What is actually likely to happen? Well, first, as I've said before, and I'll say again, sometimes a manifesto is interesting for what isn't said as what it is. In politics, there are things which are committed to and there are things which are ruled out. But in between, there's a whole mess of policies which fall there. And so it's always worth looking for the policies that senior politicians refuse to rule in or out, as there's every reason to suppose that they are at least thinking of implementing them, but would rather not say so before the election. So let's begin with Labour's statement that working people won't be facing higher taxes from Labour. Wes Streeting was apparently tackled over this, and part of the line of questioning was to point out that Lord Sugar and David Beckham are working people. The argument being that surely Labour are therefore committing to not raising anyone's taxes, other than maybe retired people, although they didn't mention that. But this is based on ignorance. Neither Alan Sugar nor David Beckham are working people. The definition of a working person is not a person who happens to do work in the loose sense. The traditional definition is someone who is employed to do manual labour. Like, I work, sure, but I'm not a worker. Now, being fair, we can probably update the definition of working person from someone employed for manual labour these days, because that doesn't cover as many people. In fact, Wes Streeting himself suggested that Labour were thinking in terms of people on lower middle incomes. In other words, Labour are defining the term more by income than type of work, which is reasonable even if not traditional. But the point is that nobody seriously considers people with an income that runs into the millions a year, especially when they own their own businesses, to be workers. That would be mental. So Sugar and Beckham, I'm sure they put a lot of effort into their income acquisition, but they're not workers. They're not working people. So what we get from this exchange is that despite being coy, Labour are only committing to not raising taxes for people on lower middle incomes. They are, of course, also committing to not raising the rate of VAT, income tax and national insurance. So that will also cover everyone else as well. But it doesn't mean they're not planning on other tax rises for those on higher incomes. One tax that Labour have not ruled out changing is capital gains tax. Penny Mordaunt was banging on about this, accusing Labour of raising taxes on the sale of your family home. Except, of course, you don't pay capital gains tax on your primary residence. Weren't we reminded of this for several months that Dan Hodges and Lord Ashcroft when they were bleating about Angela Rayner's house sale? Capital gains tax would only apply on the sale of houses that are not the place you live. In other words, for people like Jeremy Hunt, who are landlords, who buy houses for other people to live in and pay him rent. I've also yet to see any real justification for why capital gains tax should not be broadly the same as income tax anyway. I don't think most people think it's fair for wealthy people to reduce their tax burden by simply choosing to pay a different rate of tax. Notably last year, people thought it was unfair that Rishi Sunak pays a lower rate of tax than a nurse. But despite Labour not explicitly saying that they will raise capital gains tax, the fact that they're carefully avoiding any denials means at the very least they're thinking to themselves that they might, and potentially they're absolutely planning on doing so. And as only 3% of the population even pay capital gains tax, I really don't think Labour are going to have an electoral issue with this. That is even less than for inheritance tax. The bigger danger with taxation is always more people thinking they'll be liable than really are. However, although people might think they'll have to pay inheritance tax when they really won't, we noticed from polling from last year, only about 4% of people will pay inheritance tax, and yet about a third of people think they will. And that's because inheritance tax is for the future, so you don't realise you're not actually going to pay it until it comes time to realise you're not actually going to pay it. Whereas people know whether or not they pay capital gains tax in the here and now. So as long as Labour just go ahead and introduce some changes in some budget in the future, then it will be implemented before people know anything about it. And most people will not notice the difference because, do you know what? They don't pay capital gains tax. In fact, thinking about it, I see no reason why Reeves would not start making changes during her first major budget in 2025. And if the Tories want to say, you're raising capital gains tax, you didn't say you were going to do that, she could just say, well, we didn't say we weren't either. It is worth considering something else as well, though. During the recent TV debate, Penny Mordaunt also tried to tackle Rayner over capital gains tax. Rayner didn't rule out changes, but she did say there's nothing in the manifesto that needs an increase in capital gains tax. Now, this appears to be true. I've noticed a couple of sources saying that Labour's figures do appear to add up, unlike the Conservatives. However, people have expressed disappointment that there isn't more in the manifesto which will explicitly boost economic growth. But it's also worth pointing out that Labour are not ruling out changes to certain forms of Treasury income, including capital gains tax. Now, let's say that Labour did start to increase capital gains tax next year, just for the sake of argument. What would that money be used for? Not their manifesto commitments, because, as they've already noted, and independent analysts seem to be happy to accept, they are already fully funded. So, if they did raise capital gains tax, and they are not saying they won't, that means that's investment that's not mentioned in the manifesto. And then you remember that Labour have been making a big thing over the last year or so of saying that they want to under-promise and over-deliver. Well, the promise is the manifesto. So what they were basically saying is, we want to deliver more than is in the manifesto. Now, that doesn't mean we just sit back, put our feet up and go, oh, it's all fine, it'll all be brilliant. But I will say that the way things are being set up in a few years' time, it's likely to be clear that Labour will have done more than people were expecting. Put it this way, I think in 2 or 3 years, I will be getting my I told you so banner out. After all, the same thing happened with the last Labour government. I was a brand new qualified teacher with Labour in power. And in the first Parliament, the starting teacher's salary increased by 26%. And that was over 4 years. 26%. They didn't promise to do that. It wasn't in the manifesto. They just did it. Now, the economy's in way worse shape now than then. I'm not sure I see figures like that this time. But I think it's fair to say that we can expect to see similar approaches this time as well. Not everything needs to be in the manifesto. The manifesto only really exists for 2 types of policy. The first are the policies needed to win enough support to form a government, the ones that appeal to people, or the ones that rule out certain things that are unappealing. The second type of policy are those which are controversial and for which you're going to need an explicit mandate in order to get them through Parliament, for example, reforming the House of Lords. Beyond that, anything else doesn't need to be included, and there's no point in including more than strictly necessary. The reality is that governments prepare a major budget every year, except maybe where there's an emergency like COVID, which means that every single year of a Parliament, there might be 4 or 5 budgets, which means 4 or 5 changes of tax policy anyway. Labour have ruled out raising some of those taxes, but not all. They've also ruled out raising taxes for working people, which they have now defined as people on low middle incomes. I think it's fair to say that Labour will raise some taxes that are not mentioned in the manifesto, and capital gains tax, which is only paid by 3% of the population, makes sense. But the Tories are now engaged in imagining all sorts of made-up taxes that Labour are definitely going to introduce. And how do they know they're going to introduce them? Because they haven't ruled them out. To which the response from Mikey Smith in the Mirror was brilliant. The Tories, we should remember, they haven't ruled out a pay-per-mile tax on walking on pavements, or discussing the weather with colleagues, or a Wednesday tax. And what I still struggle to understand with the Tories is how they just don't get that tax is not a major factor in this election. Despite it being so high, They tried to narrow the polls with 2 rounds of tax cuts in the first quarter of this year. It didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because people are more concerned about investment, not so much taxation. People are not being won over with tax cuts or fears of taxes under Labour. After all, given that Labour have ruled out increases in the main taxes, which are the ones that most people pay, people don't really care about the rest. Only the rich care about that, which is why the Tories also care about that, despite the fact that it is now costing them the election. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.